Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Leverage Your Podcast show. And I'm really excited about this conversation because I think it's one that I haven't had with anybody, but it's thinking about ourselves as creators, and especially being in the podcasting space, whether you're a guest, whether you're a host, like you're creating content for other people to hear. And we don't think about who we are as a creator. And so I'm excited to have this conversation with Ryann Gillen, who's a transformational coach and helps people, especially with mindset, and figure out who they want to be and what kind of creator they are going to be. So I'm excited to have you on.
Awesome. I'm happy to be here, Lindsay.
Fabulous. So let's go into kind of like laying the land, so to speak.
Sure.
So as a creator,
hmm
we kind of, to me, it's like, okay, I've got all these things to do. I need to create. But I don't think we take that overarching perspective of like, what is my identity as a creator? So can you kind of
Yeah.
dive into that, like what it means and how we can wrap our heads around it?
Yeah. So a lot of the work that I do with my clients, you use the term mindset. And I said this before we hit record. I'm always leery of using the word mindset because it gets us stuck in our thinking brain, right? And what I really want to challenge you to do is get out of that thinking brain and get into that identity piece. And I love this kind of play on words with creators. That's what we are, right? We're content creators, but we're also creating our reality through how we
Mm,
show up in the world, right? So I kind of love this was totally Lindsay's angle, and I think it's brilliant and fun. But when we think of who am I as a podcast guest or who am I as a podcast host, we often think of where we are, right? Like right now, I'm new to guesting, or my show's
right.
newer, or I'm just getting started, or, I don't have a big audience, right? Like we have all the stories, but if we could pull out this idea of like, what's the vision for my show? Or what's the vision I have for wanting to guest on other people's shows? And what identity is that, right? Because the version of you that you want to show to the world is not the version of you that doesn't think you get enough downloads on your show,
Hmm.
right? That doesn't think that people like, or find your topic or information interesting, right? So your identity as a creator is built in all your expertise and all the magic you bring to the world and the way that you serve your clients and the way that you show up. Like, are you showing up as the best version of you, or are you showing up as, again, well, we only get a couple hundred downloads, or, we
Hmm.
only, I've never been invited to speak on a big show. Like I'm just speaking on small shows. And again, we tend to show up in response to our current circumstances instead of showing up where we want to go, which for, again, if you decide you want to be a podcast host, right? Like maybe you want to have a show that is, has thousands of downloads, right? Or if you're a guest, you want to be brought in on really big shows. How do I show up as that version of me now, right? What's the identity of that person now? And that's what I mean by like identity of creator, right? Like instead of where we are currently, where do we want to go? And how can we
Hmm.
start showing up more powerfully now?
And that's hard to wrap your head around
Yeah.
because you definitely get stuck in your head.
Yes.
But and you really think about your current circumstance and you're
Mhm.
and oh, it's good enough,
Yeah.
or you're comparing yourself with others, so that obviously doesn't help. But I almost feel like, and I don't know if you see this as well, but when you are a new podcast host and you're launching a show, I almost feel like there's a disconnect
Mhm.
between the show that they create and who they are. Like they're almost like, oh, I need to create the show about this because,
Yep.
or I need to focus on this niche even though I don't necessarily love it. Like it's all
Uh,
that shoulds,
yep.
that kind of eh,
Mhm.
get in the way, and it's like you don't see that person in that whole podcast.
Yeah. Well, I think that starts, Lindsay, often with like your why, right? Like we hear that in the mindset world all the time. What's your why? And if your why you're starting a podcast is because my coach said I should, or
Hmm.
I feel, again, that should concept, or, other successful people in my niche have this, versus, again, going back to the identity and how we show up. And like you said, who you're being and how your show comes out into the world. If you genuinely feel like my message is important, my words are important, what I bring to the world is important and impactful, you just show up differently,
Yeah.
right? Versus again, I'm checking a box. This is just a marketing activity. This is just, again, in the list of things that I have to do every single week is record that show this week, right? Like that's not the identity that most of us want to put forward when we
No.
record our shows or talk with other people. So I think, yeah, it goes back to what is your why? Why are you creating a podcast? Why do you want a podcast guest? And then why is that important to your bigger mission and vision?
Yeah. And I don't think we often write that down. Like we kind of have that concept in our head, like a little bit, but we don't necessarily take the time to flush it out.
Yeah.
When that's really the foundation of everything that you're going to do and all the actions that you're going to take.
Hmm.
Like, are we just lazy? Like, why don't we do that? Or we don't understand how?
I think it's neither of those things. I think it's very easy to get caught up again in the checking the boxes instead
Mm,
of casting vision. And I'm gonna give you a very specific example. I work with a lot of real estate agents and mortgage lenders. And so I have one particular real estate agent client who is growing her own brokerage. And so what that means is she's recruiting agents to, go under her brand instead of like working with a Keller Williams or a big brand, right? She's got this tiny boutique brand that's cute and fun and very female focused and minority focused. It's really beautiful. And she's like, Ryan, it's not growing. And I'm like, okay, well, what's the vision for it? And she's like, I don't, I don't know, right? Like I just want it to
mm,
grow, right? And so I think sometimes we just get so busy moving forward and doing the things and checking the boxes and taking the action that we don't sit down and think about what's the vision for my business, but then what's the vision for my podcast, right? Like
right.
where am I going with this? So I don't think it's a laziness factor. I think it's, you know, we've never been told to do that,
Fair
like
enough.
sit down and think about what's the vision for the show? Why are you creating this? How do you want to impact the world? How do you want this to impact you? Right. Like, and I think that's okay too. I think sometimes as well, we get too outward focused because we don't want to sound like I
Yes.
created this podcast to serve myself. And that's okay too. Right. Like I created my own podcast. For me personally, the reason I decided to create a show, Lindsay, was because I got tired of guesting and pitching myself as guests or hiring agencies to pitch me when I was like, if I create a platform and I invite them to me, right? Like now I
Mm,
get to hand select who do I want to network with? Who do I want to talk
yes.
to? So like my show is yes to share my gift with the world, which I do think is powerful and important, but it's also a leverage opportunity for me to connect with people who probably wouldn't have a conversation with me otherwise, right? So like I know
Yes.
that's the vision and intention of my show. So when I reach out to someone and say, hey, I would like to have you on my show. I know what my intention is, right? I know what that looks like. I know what that vision is. I know how to support that instead of like, it'd be kind of cool to interview people who are leaders in real estate, right? Like that's great and fun, right? But the vision is if I can have really great, thoughtful conversations with these people, they're going to share that podcast with their audience. And then
Yeah.
their audience is going to start listening to my show, right? And like having intention and having vision, I think is really, really important because again, then I can put my podcaster identity on for the moment, right? And go out and reach out to guests I'm really excited to talk to. But if I don't have that clear vision, if I don't have that clear intention, I'm not going to spend the hour doing research to reach out
Right.
to those people and invite them to be a guest on my show. So I think that's often what winds up happening is again podcasting, creating content is something that we all have to do as business owners. And so we try to find what works best for us, but we don't necessarily sit down and think about like, what is the intention behind this particular thing? And I would encourage you guys to do this about anything in your business,
True.
right? Like if it's your podcast, if you host webinars or run challenges or create video content, on social media, like if you give everything a job, right? Like it's
Mm.
going to go way better. It's like going, on a road trip where you're like, well, we're just going to go to the West Coast. I live in the Midwest, right? Like that's a really big range.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what happens when we just start something without a vision and intention for it. We're just
Yeah.
driving, just like my client who's growing a brokerage that has no vision. Of course, it's not going to
Right.
grow. If you don't plant the seeds and water the seeds and take care of the seeds, it's not going to grow. And
Yeah.
that's vision and your podcast.
That makes total sense. And I think getting that sometimes it takes having a coach
Yeah.
or having, a mentor, a mastermind to really
Yes.
flush out those details and like talk it
Absolutely.
out. Because
Yeah.
sometimes you can get in your own head or
Of
self
course.
doubt, or you're just like,
Absolutely.
I don't know where to start. It's like you need
Mhm.
someone to pull that out of you sometimes.
Yeah. I believe like podcasting in particular, like it's easy enough, right? But it's also something that you do have to feel passionate about what you're
Hmm.
doing. So I believe most people, yeah, having a coach or a mentor or somebody to hold a mirror up for you is really powerful, but also just being really honest with yourself, right? Like, and having it be okay if it's for you.
Yeah.
And what I
Yeah.
mean by that is like, again, like letting it be okay that, like, yes, my podcast is my give to the world. It's my service to the world. It's the way that I teach and provide value for free in a really powerful way. But it's also a sales tool in my business. And I treat it that way and I show up with it that way. And again, that is a very different energy behind. I cross my fingers and hope and pray that somebody pitches me a really good guest, or that somebody wants to be on my show, or somebody reaches out to me and wants me to be on their show, right? Instead of, again, setting really clear intention of
Yeah.
what it is. So being okay with the idea if it's self-serving, because that's the point.
Yeah. It's fine. It's okay. Yes. Now, once you have kind of like, okay, I've got a vision. I know
Yep.
what it is that I want. I know how I want to use guesting or podcasting in my business. How do you, I have two questions, so I'll do the one first. How do you bring yourself into that? Because I find
Mhm.
it's very easy to, like you said, check off those boxes or create something that you think you should create because other people
Mhm.
are creating it. I
Yeah.
think we get stuck sometimes of like, how can I be my true self? How can I bring my personality to the table and create something that is authentic to me and
Sure.
not somebody else?
This is actually kind of funny advice, especially because we're both podcast hosts with podcasts, is stop consuming, right? Like, to me, the
Ooh,
biggest reason why, and I have a love-hate relationship with podcasts, Lindsay, for this reason, because it's so easy to consume, right? Like, oh, I'm going
yeah.
to listen to this person. I'm going to listen to this person. I'm going to listen to this person. And before you know it, you don't even know who you are anymore. So if
Mm,
you do feel like you're struggling to find out, like, who am I authentically, stop consuming for a week, right? Like, stop. And really, then what ideas come to mind, right? Then where do you feel inspired? Then where do you feel excited, right? Like, and really following that. Because again, I think sometimes we don't even do it intentionally, right? We're just, again, we're consuming content, we're on social media, we're listening to podcasts, we're watching other people. Maybe we are in masterminds or coaching programs and we're watching the people around us. And again, that's where the shoulds come in that we've mentioned a couple of times. So if you're asking yourself the question, like, is this an inspired idea? Is this a really good idea? Or is this just me observing other people and picking up their
mm,
material? That's what I call it with my clients. Stop doing it for a week or so,
right.
right? Like, and then see what gets you excited about those ideas, right? Like, why? And again, going back to your why and getting to that place. So I think for me, it's like, how do we show up? For instance, I went back and forth. I use the F word pretty regularly. And I went back and forth as to whether or not I wanted to put that in my show, right? Because if I
Hmm.
put it on my show, now I have an explicit rating and are people not going to listen to me and blah, blah, blah. But to me, it felt disingenuous to not drop the F bomb on occasion when I felt like it was
Mm.
important,
Yeah, yeah.
because that's who I am, right?
Yeah.
Like, and if I don't put that in my content and I don't put it in my short form video content and I don't put it in my emails, somebody's going to wind up in a call with me and be very shocked.
That's hilarious. That's a valid point.
So, you know what I'm saying? So, for me, that's the way I show up authentically. I talk
Right.
really fast. For many
Yes,
years,
you
I
do.
made that, I do.
I love it.
For many years, I made that a problem, right? Like, oh, I got to slow
Mm.
down and all this other stuff. But every time I tried to slow myself down, a little bit of my sparkle went away, right? So it was like, okay, I talk fast, and the people who want to listen to me are either going to figure out how to listen to it on like zero point 0.5 speed, or I'm just not going to be for you, right? Like,
Yeah.
but being okay with that. Like, I think that's the really important part of this. Podcasting in general is a mass market tool, right? Meaning it reaches everyone, but you're not for everyone, and that's okay. And I think that's a really, really important part of being your authentic self, is not feeling like you have to appeal to everyone, cater to everyone, meet everyone's expectations, right? Like, be true to yourself and true
Yeah.
to your business and who you serve. That's the most important part of the podcast. And I'm sorry if we offended your grandma with the F bomb in my show, but my clients need to know it's coming.
Yeah, yeah. Fair enough. Yeah, because really, if they hear you on a podcast and you're one way,
Yeah.
and then they meet you like in your program and you're
Yeah.
another way, that's jarring. And then
Yes.
there's a huge disconnect. So
Hmm.
you're almost doing yourself a disservice
Yeah.
by not being yourself.
And then it almost unconsciously creates a lack of trust, right?
Oh
Like I don't think
yeah,
anybody
yeah,
naturally
valid.
is like, oh, well, I don't trust that Lindsay girl because she's not the same and blah blah blah. They're not
Yeah,
saying that, but it's unconscious where you're like, which one of you is it? Like who are you, right? Like are
yeah,
you the person who talks too fast and drops F-bombs and talks with her hands? Or are you the person who's got her hands folded in her lap and is really polite and
yeah,
gives politically correct answers and doesn't use curse words? And, like, who are you really? And
yeah,
like I said, I don't think anybody like is consciously saying that, but it's like almost, it creates this unconscious breach of, I don't know what it is about that person that I just can't get a beat
yeah,
on? It's because, again, you're showing up differently in different
yeah,
places.
100%. And I think people, if they're like a very stiff persona, it's hard to connect with that person.
Yeah.
If you're like have abrasive opinions
Yeah.
or, you're very energetic, then you either connect or you don't connect with that. And
Yes.
that's fine.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And I think, and that's the point, right? Like that's the point of all marketing is
Yeah.
to, attract who you want to attract and repel who you don't, right? But because again, society programming says that we're supposed to be well liked, and if we're not well liked, it's a problem. We oftentimes
I
have a
know.
hard time putting our stake in the ground, right? Standing for what we want to, showing up, like I had a client tell me that too. She's like, "Do you not get like endless comments on your short form video content about your F-bombs?" Because she's like, I do. Like people say
Oh,
nasty things to me on like comments, like on Instagram and stuff like that. And I'm like, no, I don't. And she's like, I wonder why. And I'm like, because energetically, I don't care.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
it's not a problem. You're worried about it, right?
Yeah,
Like, so
yeah.
you think maybe I shouldn't be doing this. Should I not be doing this? And people can feel that, right? With me, I'm like, my mom asked me once if I would stop using the F bomb in my content, and I said no. And that was the only person who I felt compelled to explain
Yeah,
myself.
exactly. That's so true. I know I had someone once tell me that I was like too casual, or I forget what the words they used, and it tripped me up for a little bit. And I'm like, "Oh, should I be?" I'm like, "Then what am I doing wrong?" You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
like on podcasts and how I
sure.
engage with the
Yeah,
guests and stuff like that. And I was kind of I went, "Well, I can't be anything
yeah,
else." Like
right.
but it really tripped me up for like
Of
a week,
course.
and then I had to like let it go. And I'm like,
Yeah,
I'm just gonna be me. Like I get other feedback from people that like, oh, you make
sure.
me feel so welcome and it's easy to have a conversation with you. I'm like, okay, then I can't be all
Yeah.
that bad. But you do kind of get tripped up by some people's like comments.
Yeah. And that's how it like, and since I started coaching entrepreneurs, I started my business as a sales coach a million years ago, Lindsay. That was always my favorite when people be like, well, so and so said. And I'm like, does that person
Mm,
pay your mortgage? And they're like, no. Does that person live in your house? No. Then their opinion doesn't matter.
yeah, fabulous. Yeah, sometimes
Like
you got to tell
that's
yourself that.
yeah, like if you don't pay my, and sometimes the person who lives in your house with you, their opinion don't matter either. But like those are my benchmarks, right? Like if you're
Yeah,
not paying
yeah,
the bills, if you're not paying my payroll or paying my mortgage or anything like that, and you don't live in this house and I don't have to talk to you every day, your opinion is yours and you're entitled to it. But I can't make that I can't show up differently because of that in any
yeah.
capacity, like podcasting or otherwise. Because again, I came from corporate and I had to like find my
Mm,
casualness. And I
yeah.
still have days where like I will intentionally throw on a hoodie like for a podcast interview or something along those lines because that again, that's what you're going to get from
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
And so if I just got, because, oh, it's podcast guesting day, let me
Have
put
to
on
be
this
all, yeah,
blazer,
yeah.
and all this other stuff when it's like the only way you're catching me in a blazer is for like a brand photo shoot, then
Yes.
that's not it, right? So, just really thinking through that idea of who am I and how am I showing up as the most authentic version of myself? And it's totally different. If the blazer helps you wear the persona of what
Hmm.
I have to say is important and it's supporting you in some way, wear the blazer, right?
Yes,
But
yes.
you are forcing yourself to put on the blazer because you think that's the expectation that someone has of
Right.
you, then we're having a different conversation.
Yeah, 100%. Now we've got the vision, we
Yeah.
kind of know who we are, but when we have that vision, it's like, okay, here's who I want to be, here's what I want to create.
Hmm.
Like, how do you know how to bridge that gap and get from A to B? Because I feel like that's the hard part.
Sure. I'm going to challenge you to not see it as a gap and see it
Mm,
as a destination, right? So
okay.
again, just like a road trip. So I live in Kansas City. If I'm going from Kansas City to California, I'm going to spend the majority of the drive with more time ahead of me than behind me, right? First half of the drive, if
Mm-hmm.
it's, I think it's about a 20-hour drive, give or take,
Ooh,
right? The first, I know, not that we're driving often, but you know what I'm saying? The first 10 hours, there's always more ahead of me than there is behind me, right? And even when I'm 15 hours in, there's still 5 hours ahead of me and 15 hours behind me. And the point that I'm giving you in this is that I think we often think we're going to arrive at some point in time. I'm going to show up someday and then I'm going to be a professional podcaster. It's going to happen. Like, no, you're
mm,
that person now. Like you are that person now. I'm going to California, whether I have 20 hours left or 2 hours left.
right,
I'm on my way to California. Right. So it's not a gap as far as like, I got to figure like every day you're putting one foot in front of the other to get from where you are to where you want to go. So again, let's use the example of downloads or views or wherever you're getting your data, right? So say you're looking at your data, you're like, gosh, I only had, 18 people watch last week's show. Well, but if there were 18 people in your living room listening to you talk, wouldn't that be valuable and interesting? Wouldn't you be excited about that? Like that's kind of the first thing. So even when there's only, and I'm using air
yeah,
quotes, only 18 people in your audience, that's 18 people that think what you have to say is important, which means you have taken the first step towards being somebody who has thousands of downloads or thousands of listeners,
right,
right? So every single step you take is movement towards where you are going. There's no, I mean, again, theoretically, there's a gap, but like that, but that's just where I'm going. My destination is California. My destination is top rated podcast host. My destination is somebody who is interviewed on all different sizes of shows, right? Like that's the destination. And I got to get in the car and start driving. And it doesn't mean that I'm not getting to California because I'm only 2 hours into my 20-minute drive, right? It doesn't mean
right,
that I'm never going to have a show with thousands of downloads because I only have 18 now. It just means that today it's 18 and next week it's 34 and the week after that it's 102, right? As long as I keep focused on my vision and follow my roadmap and follow my plans, take care of my car, right? Put gas in it, stop for snacks on occasion, I'm going to wind up in California as long as you stay focused and take care of
right.
yourself and stay focused on the vision, you will meet that vision for your show or for yourself as a guest. So, like I said, I don't even like to think of it as like there's a gap. Yeah, sure, there's a gap. But every day you're taking steps towards what you want. It's just a matter of am I 2 hours into my drive or am I 18 hours into my drive? But at the end of the day, I'm still going to wind up in California.
Yeah,
As long as you can be that disciplined in your vision and in your action, that's really the key here, right, Lindsay?
yeah,
I think most of us, we get stuck somewhere. I don't know. I think halfway would be what, like Arizona or something, right? Like we get stuck, and we're like, I'm tired. There's no gas in this car, and then we
yeah,
like turn around and go back, instead of resting for a moment. And I think
right.
that's the really important part of this is like if you're committed to that vision and that vision is part of what you're building and you see this and you feel called that podcasting and guesting and sharing your content and your gifts with the world is the way that you're going to grow and the way that you want to, the key is just to show up and do it every day knowing what the destination is.
Yeah, I love that because that it totally reframes it in your brain
Yeah.
and like you're doing it, you're going
Yeah.
like no matter what. And yeah, I think when we visually see a gap, it just
Yeah.
feels like that destination is so far
Mhm.
away.
Yeah. And the only way that it becomes not far away is if you start the journey.
Yeah.
Like you have to start. And again, and I also think that that's a really important part of it too, is we see contrast is the word that I typically use, but we see contrast as a problem. And what I mean by that is,
Mm,
okay, I've been producing my show for a couple of months now and it's not growing the way that I want it to, or I've been reaching out to guests and they don't want to be on my show because I don't have enough listeners, or again, I'm being the only people who say yes to wanting to have me on their show have no audience, right? Like we see that as a problem. And my favorite way to look at that is what is this preparing me for?
ooh.
Right? Like, and so I'm going to give you a very specific example. I used to teach sales to new entrepreneurs, and I used to tell them to talk to anybody who would talk to them. And they would be like, but why? Like, that person's not my ideal client. And I'm like, I don't want your very first sales conversation to be with your ideal client because you're probably going to be bad.
Ah,
Do you know what I'm saying? Like you're probably not like your sales call is probably not going to go
totally.
as well as it could, right? Like you're going to stumble and you're going to be awkward and you're not going to know what to do and like cuz that's what it's like to be a beginner. So sometimes when we feel like we're stuck in this beginner phase, it's like, what is this preparing me for, right? Like I'm getting better, right? I'm building my brand. I'm being more authentic. I'm being more of myself. I'm figuring out the style of my show. I'm figuring out again what sort of content best resonates with me and my audience. What do I get most excited to create, right? Like I'm still preparing for my journey to California. I just, am here because there were some things I needed to do before I got on the road, right? Like we needed to change the oil in the car, right? Like rotate the tires and all those different things. But, and again, I'm glad I picked the car analogy. It's serving me very well right now.
It
But
is.
you know what I'm saying? Like, so sometimes we get stuck in it's not happening fast enough, but sometimes it's simply because you're preparing for, right? You don't want a million downloads when you're still like and and I don't know how to open my show and I
Right.
don't know how to close my show and I'm not 100% sure if this is the type of content, like the style of content I want to create. Like again, in the beginning, I think of this often. I have a love-hate relationship with Russell Brunson, if I'm fully honest, but he talks so much in the beginning of his podcast. He was like, I didn't look at the number for 2 years
Oh,
because
wow.
I didn't want to know. Like he was like, I knew it was probably not very good. And I didn't want to know that nobody was listening because
Didn't
I
want to be
was just
tripped up.
practicing. So
Yeah.
one way or the other, it was going to stress me out, right? If nobody was listening, it wasn't good enough. And if people were listening, I wasn't good enough. So one way or
Yeah.
the other, I didn't want to know. And I love that piece of advice so much, right? Where it's just like sometimes in the beginning, we got to get prepared. We got to
Yeah.
practice. Professional athletes did not like I always think of like Lewis Howes, right? Like he's built such a beautiful brand in podcasting and he
Hmm.
has the most incredible guests. I've not done the research. This is not like fact check me, but I encourage you to go back 5 years. Who was he interviewing 5 years ago? They're probably not people you've ever heard of.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, the shows probably weren't that good. People probably didn't fly in and sit in his studio with him
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
record shows, right? Like that was not how he started.
Yeah.
And so
Everyone
again,
starts somewhere, right? Like you,
yes,
and I
we all
always
start as
tell,
beginners.
yeah, you're going to suck for the first few anyways. So just
Yeah.
know that and move on.
Yes. Yes. And I think that's like to me, that's the most important part of what do I do between point A and point B is you go to work,
Mm,
you
yeah.
practice, you get good, you prepare for the trip, right? Like that's what you do. When you book a vacation that's 6 months away, what do you do between now and when that vacation happens? The first few months, you don't do a whole lot, right? Then you start thinking about what am I going to need? What's the weather going to look like?
Right.
Do we need a new bathing suit? Like I live in the Midwest. So, we were talking about a spring break vacation. And that was instantly what I thought. I was like, I'm going to have to buy the kids new bathing suits because their bathing suits from last year aren't going to fit. And I'm going to have to order those on Amazon because bathing suits aren't going to be in the stores here before then, right? Like, and again, I'm just giving you these analogies and these examples of things I'm thinking about. We're recording this in January, right? Like I'm talking
Yeah.
about a trip at, the first week in April, I think is when my kids' spring break is. You know what I'm saying? And I'm like, okay, write that down. Gonna need bathing suits,
Yeah.
And like that's the sort of stuff.
Crap.
We don't just book the trip and go on vacation tomorrow.
Right. Yeah.
I
Valid.
mean, if you're really adventurous, you do. But generally
I
speaking,
know.
most of us don't, right? So again, we have this unreasonable expectation. Not even I don't want
That's
to say
so true.
unreasonable, but this expectation of like, well, I'm a podcast, like, why am I
You
not
don't give
famous
yourself a
yet?
break. It's like,
No. Or
yeah.
give it time to work.
Yes.
Again,
100%. We're so impatient.
I always think of reaping and sowing, right? And whether you're looking at it from a farming perspective or a biblical perspective or a spiritual perspective, right? Like we don't always reap and sow in the same season. And so
Right.
sometimes you're just planting seeds and watering
Yeah.
the seeds. And, but you don't dig the seeds back up and you're like, are you still in there? Right? Like, and we plan for I'm a Midwest girl, sorry, but like we plan for some runoff, like
Yeah.
they encourage you to overplant because some of them are going to get eaten and some of them are going to get washed away in the rain, right? So like if we think through what is the again intention and vision of my podcast or the message I want to share with other hosts, how I've got to plant those seeds and I've got to water those seeds and take care of those seeds and prepare for whatever it is your vision is. And that's the distance between point A and point B. It's
Yeah.
it's life.
I love that. And I think it's okay too to let yourself experiment and like if
Yes.
something doesn't work out, like
Yeah.
then ditch it and try a different intro for your podcast, whatever it may be. Like I feel like
Mhm.
there's no rules. If you want to
No.
change it, no one's going to criticize you. Some people may not even notice. It's like whatever, make it what you want. And if you need to pivot, pivot.
Yes. I think that's such an important conversation, right? Of like the shoulds and the rules. Because, what I tell myself and my clients very often is like the rules are made up.
Yeah.
The rules are made up. Like whoever made podcasting rules about needing an intro and outro and blah, 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 blah. Like, I don't know about you guys, but like I fast forward through the intro. I don't care, right? And
Yeah,
like you're so worried about the perfect music
I
for the
know.
intro, right? And then I'm like, I don't listen to it anyway. Get to the content. That's what I'm here for, right? And I
Yeah.
mean, again, I'm not saying there's an intro on my show. I'm not saying go make
Yeah.
one. I'm just saying like so often we get ourselves so caught up in the details and the shoulds and the have tos and the rules when it's like at the end of the day, again, if the vision and the mission is to share your gifts with the world, hit record and let's go.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. I don't know why we get so caught up in the shoulds and I guess it's like comparing ourselves to other people, worried about being judged.
Yeah,
It
it's
can
all of
be
those things.
debilitating.
It really, really can when you're not clear on your vision
Mm,
and where you're going.
yeah.
Because when you are clear, like I tell my clients this all the time, is if you are clear on where you're going, but the things on your list to get you there, you can't bring yourself to do them. Like you're procrastinating, you're
Ooh.
putting them off, like then something is out of alignment, right? Like I think when we're aligned and we're on fire and we're excited and we're doing something because it pumps us up and it gets us closer to our goals and it supports our vision, we are way more likely to do it scared, do it not very good, do it all those different ways. So sometimes it is just, again, an opportunity to reflect. And I use the example, I just recently launched a new show because I made a major pivot from, again, sales and business development to really the transformational coaching. And I recorded an episode and didn't record the audio. I don't know what happened. I don't know if it was me. I don't know. But I re-recorded that show on a Sunday morning because I wanted to, when I released the show, to have 3 episodes for people to go listen to.
Hmm.
And so anyway, I got up on a Sunday morning, took a shower, got ready because I wanted to be on camera to record the show. And it wasn't, again, I was kind of grumbly about it for a minute, but like there was no stopping me. Like the show was going live on Monday.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
content wasn't perfect. Like it was an important piece of what I had put together for the 3 shows. I didn't want to just launch with 2. There was no procrastination in that moment, right? Like I
Right.
just did it because it was part of the vision of what I had. And so again, if you're
Yes.
having a hard time taking action, you have to start asking yourself, like, where am I out of alignment? And sometimes the out of alignment is just coming from I'm so terrified of what other people are going to think, right?
Mm.
And the truth of the matter is, again, if they don't pay your mortgage and they don't live in your house, their opinion doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And to your point, it doesn't mean it doesn't sting, right? When somebody says, "Oh, you're too casual,
I
Lindsay," or
know.
whatever, right? Like I'm not trying to be insensitive here, but at the end of the day, like whatever your list of people whose opinions matter, like is the random stranger on the internet really that person or that mean critical person from, high school who's going to think it's ridiculous that you think you're important enough to create a podcast? Like this is my benchmark. I grew up in a small town in Kansas. And my rule of thumb is if I ran into them in Walmart, because that's what happens in small towns in Kansas, would I turn and walk like would I try to avoid them? Or would I want to have a conversation with them? That was how like I went through my Facebook friends list and decided who I still needed to be friends with and not.
Ooh.
You know what I'm saying? And
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
if I saw you in Walmart and I didn't want to be like, oh my God, how are you? What's going on? Then I deleted you. But like those are often the people we're afraid of judging us, right?
So
It's those
true.
people who, if we ran into them somewhere or saw them somewhere, we would avoid them or turn and run the other way, right? It's that old nasty, mean colleague that you used to work with
Yeah.
in your 20s that, like you don't like those people anyway.
So true. You're keeping it real, Ryan.
That's what I do.
I know. I love it. This has been such a great conversation, and I hope it's really helped people kind of think a little bit more intentionally
Mm.
of how they're showing up as a creator, being a
Yes.
guest, being a host, what kind of show they really want to create and have, and what they want to project of themselves, and to, like you said, not get from A to B, but like make those visions a reality.
Yes.
Yeah. So how can people find you? If you
Yes.
have any resources to
Yeah.
share,
Yes.
go for it. I would love to help others.
Yeah, I spend most of my time these days on TikTok and YouTube. I'm at Ryann Gillen Official, so it's Ryan with 2 N's. Um, and that is the best place to find me on social media. I have a really great training. It's called the Uncensored Self, And it is
Oh,
really kind of the framework of how I work with my clients on their mindset and their energy and their identity. And so you can go to livelifeuncensored.com/audio. It's about a 25-minute audio training
oh,
that really
perfect.
kind of breaks things down. And then I host a show called The Uncensored Self with Ryann Gillen. It is available everywhere you listen to podcasts, and I break down all sorts of different topics and ideas. I really kind of tried to bridge, the practical with the woo and the spiritual,
Hmm.
like we all, I believe, most of the people who come into my world, they're aware and open to the work, but they're like, how do I make it work? And so that's really what I
Yeah,
do in most of my content is how do I take these really esoteric ideas that sound really good and really fun and actually make them work in my business. And so that's what I spend a lot of time doing content wise.
I love that because I find a lot of entrepreneurs sometimes there's all these concepts and thoughts and theories, but I'm such a practical, pragmatic person. I'm like, okay, but
Right.
what do I do now? And so the fact that you break
Yeah.
it down is and make it
Yeah.
real, like everybody needs that in
Yep.
their lives.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah. So thank you again for coming.
Yes.
What a great convo. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, folks. And we will see you next week on another episode of the Leverage Your Podcast Show. Have a great one.
Bye, guys.